Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Our next session asks a deceptively simple yet deeply consequential question. Does the media spread truth or does it spread polarization? In an age of instant news, viral clips, and competing narratives, media no longer merely reports events, it frames them. This session will explore where journalism stands today as a force for accountability or truth, or as a driver of division in an already polarized world. To examine this critical issue, we are joined by an exceptional panel of journalists and media professionals. First, Dr. Zeinab Badawi, who is the president of the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and an internationally respected journalist whose work has shaped global conversations on history, power, and representation. Joining her is Rahim Shamsi from Nukta, a prominent journalist and anchor known for her incisive interviews and focus on public accountability. We also welcome Azad Essa from the Middle East Eye, an award-winning journalist whose reporting examines media narratives, geopolitics, and the impact of journalism on public discourse. Moderating today's discussion is Fahd Hussain from Express News, a senior journalist recognized for steering complex debates with clarity and balance. Please welcome our panel of speakers. I will now hand over the session to Fahd Hussain. Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum, and thank you all for coming today. I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion on the scope of and the role of media. And as the topic suggests, does the media serve the truth or polarize? Or just to give it a twist, does it serve itself by polarizing? Now, today we have a very good panel because I think we are going to have views from journalists who've worked in different media organizations in different countries, who've covered different stories from completely different areas, including, of course, Pakistan. Two of us are here from Pakistan, so we'll try and bring that perspective also. But generally, what personally I would like to achieve from today's discussion is to get a globalized look at the very serious challenges that are facing the media and the challenges faced by society through the media. So a couple of trends that we will touch upon, of course, is how the deep polarization in societies, including Pakistan and abroad, and in the globe, is actually feeding a new business model for the media. Polarization pays. It helps garner audiences and followers and likes and comments. So if polarization is actually incentivizing the media, then what happens to the primary role of actually trying to serve up truth? Then, of course, we will also look at how the media has behaved in the last couple of years in terms of the Middle East, the genocide in Gaza, how the Western media, which has always been the pallbearer for accuracy and neutrality and professionalism and fact-based reporting, how it was able to severely damage its own credibility, the way that it covered Gaza, the way it continues to cover the Middle East. We have very respected Zeinab Badawi, who's worked for BBC, so her comments would be invaluable. Shamsi herself has worked for BBC, so her perspective would be valuable. And of course, Azad Essa Sahab has worked for Al Jazeera English. So, you know, we will, on this particular thing, we'll have a good perspective. And then also, not just the Middle East, if we come closer to home, specifically in reference to the India-Pakistan war in May, how the media covered that, how we saw how the Indian media went completely berserk. So the pitfalls and shortfalls of media polarization in South Asia, and of course closer to home. Hum log bhi doodh se dhule hue nahi hai. So the problems in Pakistan, the issue of how much space we have, how space is shrinking, and how when faced with shrinking press and pressures, what does the media actually do? And in the end, I think we'll also quickly talk about whether actually, in this day and age, where polarization sells, is it even possible to find an audience that does not want polarizing content? And if that's not possible, then is journalism dying? So we'll talk about all of these things, and I'd like to start first with Zeinab Badawi. Based on all of these points, you've had such a fantastic career in journalism, and now you're doing a bunch of other stuff outside of journalism also. And I was just talking to somebody and saying that, I would at some point, I'm going to ask you, is there life after journalism? Because all of us are actually now trying to figure out if there is actually life after journalism. So is journalism dying?
Thank you very much indeed, Fahad, and good afternoon to all of you. It's very good to be with you here in the beautiful historic city of Lahore and with my fellow panelists. So is journalism dying? Well, I think that, first of all, when we talk about the media, it's not a monolithic block. There are good parts of the media and there are parts that polarize. And I've worked, of course, in the mainstream or legacy media for 4 decades, more than 4 decades. And what I would say is this, is that the media has fragmented, but the mainstream legacy media, the public service broadcasters like the BBC or Channel 4 in the UK, they still really try to seek balance, accuracy, and in a world where there are competing alternative truths, to try to uncover the truth where they can. And I think there still is a role for the trained journalist. We've seen many self-styled citizen journalists. Anybody with a mobile phone now can take images or whatever and style themselves as a journalist. But I still think that those people who've benefited from a long career or experience and try to achieve balance and accuracy and seeking out the truth in an increasingly polarized world, there undoubtedly is a place for them. And I think that, I can't speak for the whole of the BBC, obviously, it's a huge corporation, but I think on the whole, it does very well indeed. Of course, it makes mistakes sometimes. The reporters, the journalists, we all have to work in very difficult circumstances. You mentioned the conflict in Gaza, where international journalists were not allowed to go in. Now they can go in, but only under supervision from the Israeli authorities. So, these kind of situations present challenges for traditional journalists because they can't get in, but we rely on a network of very good journalists, Palestinian journalists who are actually in Gaza. The BBC has teams and teams of monitors and verifiers who will look at video that comes in. If you see what's happened recently in the protests in Iran, which again presented a huge challenge for us to know what was going on, we'll get lots and lots of videos, what's known as UGC, user-generated content, and you will have, Farsi speakers, Iranians who will sit there just looking at all this video, trying to look at landmarks and monuments, listening to accents to try to verify whether they really are coming from these particular regions. And they'll put together a picture, even in the absence of being there. When we heard that the protests happened in Iran, people were saying, oh, there are millions out on the streets. Well, actually, there weren't millions out on the streets. You have to try to verify that. So is there a role for the traditional journalist? Undoubtedly, in a world where people seek echo chambers, I still think that there are many people, possibly even a silent majority, who are still trying to find, what is real and what isn't. And of course, we also have to deal with AI-generated content where images appear which don't even exist. So I would give a shout out to the journalists. And I talk about broadcast journalism because I think increasingly that's what people are looking at, the images. But of course, print journalism is a completely different thing as well. And there are some very honorable newspapers. You yourself write a weekly column. People want to know you know, what your perspective is, respected figures like you and my fellow panelists. So I think don't do yourself out of a job, and don't turn your back on journalism. Yes, there is life after journalism, but I'm quite long in the tooth, much older than you. So you carry on doing what you're doing.
But thank you for saying that. But Azad, you know, she talked about BBC and Gaza and how it was everything was reported. And you know, we've all been taught the fundamental skills of journalism, the process of verification, how to get the story right, double, triple checking, getting the context right, etc., etc. You know, there are degrees, there are trainings, there are boot camps, you know, everything that any profession should have. But despite all of that, when it came to, and I'm referring to Gaza because that's been the biggest story of our times in recent years. When it came to that particular story, I think majority of people in the world would agree that the mainstream media was not able to actually accurately call a genocide what it was, a genocide. They were not able to do that. Why was that? Despite decades of professional training and ethos and craft of journalism having been honed, why? Why could they not? Was that because of the polarization around that issue, or was it something else?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there's always, I talked about balance and accuracy, and for the public service broadcasters like the BBC, there are political considerations that have to be taken into account also. The British government didn't say it was a genocide in Gaza, and the International Criminal Court, of course, did indict Benjamin Netanyahu and a couple of others, and also, you know, named some Hamas officials and so on. But that was pending their trial. So I think that journalists cannot be self-appointed arbiters of, you know, they're not members of the judiciary. They can't be self-appointed and say this is what is happening, particularly when they haven't been able to go into somewhere. But what the journalists did do, relying on the testimony of people who spoke to them on phones and doctors that they talked to, was to say there's going to be huge, you know, food insecurity. There's going to be huge, you know, deaths and injuries and so on. And they were right on that, and they did call that out.
Azad Essa, your take on the same.
Thanks for the question. Hello, everyone, again. So I think that this is a difficult question to answer, because for those who didn't call it a genocide, we'd have to ask them why they didn't call it a genocide. I don't know why they didn't do so. But from my perspective, I think that, you know, what the Gaza genocide showed us was basically the inequities and the inequalities when it comes to how news is told and from which place it is told. So what I mean by this is that for starters, much of the Western press didn't believe or didn't want to talk about the journalists in Palestine who were being killed. They didn't believe that they were journalists in the first place. So that's the first part. And so if you don't believe that people who are journalists and then being killed for narrating stories, and how would you believe that the stories that are coming out of that place? So it means that you're relying on stories by people that you believe are vetted, people that you believe are serious journalists. And so I think that is part of the dehumanization of a place, of Palestine and of many places. You can say the same of Kashmir, for instance. Now, the second part is that we've also seen that you know, people talk about public broadcasters and private broadcasters, and if you are part of a public broadcasting media house, then it's ordinarily assumed that you are taking the state line. But then there's also a case of private houses basically, you know, taking the state line or taking on representing the interests of the investors, right? And so you think about the New York Times, or you think about Washington Post, or many of these other mainstream publications, they were representing someone, you know, in terms of how they narrated the news. And so many of this information that came from these publications were like written by almost state stenographers, right? And also coming from the perspective of the perception of who is legitimate. And I'm going maybe in a circle here, but many of the journalists who are writing for the New York Times and writing for these Western publications had either worked in the Israeli military or living in settlements or married to people who are in the military, but they are seen as sort of on the right side of history, right? And so the moment you decide who's on the right side of history, then everybody else is outside of that. Now, on the question of genocide, it is difficult, as Zeinab has said, that it is difficult for journalists to decide when something's a genocide. And it becomes sort of dangerous, like when do you decide? But there were many publications who would also ignore the sort of preliminary findings of the ICJ. So wouldn't even say, listen, the ICJ preliminary found that, it meets the provisional elements or whatever it was of genocide. So that stuff was totally marginalized. I don't know if I need to say anything more.
I think that makes a lot of sense, but what it also does, Amber, is that it's pointing towards the fact that the way that we've done journalism, mainstream journalism, is not enough to satisfy the demands of society anymore. Digital, social, AI, all of those have whetted the appetite so much that boring old mainstream legacy media journalism is not cutting it anymore. And that puts added pressure on mainstream media to try and be more like the non-mainstream media in order to somehow retain its relevance. Now, you worked in international organizations, you worked in local television, you've been on screen, off screen, and now you're the editor for Nukta, which is one of the largest digital platforms in Pakistan. Working in digital, aren't you even more dependent on polarized content? Because the quality of content is dependent less on your editorial judgment as the editor and more on how many people like it. And that kind of skews the whole balance. Is that a problem?
Actually, I'd say no. And I think there's a couple of things here. I think you just, in terms of, I want to address structural issues. For instance, Western media in Gaza, how many were, for instance, in Gaza to report on Gaza? It was journalists from Al Jazeera, as an example, who were killed, many of whom were killed. Plus, so these structural issues and what the audience sees, and that's the point I'm going to come to with digital platforms such as Nukta, which are new. The audience wants to see as much as they want to see what's happening. So for instance, if we take the example of Gaza and the fact that there's many Western journalists who may not be there to report on what's happening, but they are, as Azad also pointed out, people who may not be qualified to be journalists, but they are in the location where the conflict is happening and they're reporting it as they see it. So that is something that audiences like to see, which is a good thing. The negative thing is that audiences do have biases. Audiences do have preferences. Audiences do want to confirm those biases. And as the editor of a digital platform that for whom numbers are really important, that is a struggle. I'm not going to deny it. And I think that we see over and over again with the world in the kind of disruption space that we are seeing, multiple conflicts, social media platforms, and the influx of so much information. What happens is that the emotive part of the brain for anybody kicks in when they're scrolling on TikTok or Instagram or Twitter, and they want to further confirm what they believe rather than have it challenged or questioned. So the audience actually, I think, is at the heart of this. And as journalists, whether I was working obviously for television, in which we were very concerned about ratings, same problems, same problem. We were concerned about ratings. We had to get popular people on and talk about popular things rather than perhaps more, stories that required more depth or nuance. Same thing with television. It's the same thing, I would say, on speed in terms of digital platforms, because there's just too much information. The good thing, the experience that I've had with Nukta, we launched in October 2025. One of the rare things about Nukta compared to many other content creators or digital platforms is that we have reporters, which is very important for me as a journalist. And what we found is reporters who were in the field reporting on events, bringing witnesses, people who are on the ground to tell that story, whether it's Gul Plaza in Karachi or whether it is the conflict between India and Pakistan, people who are impacted, human interest stories. We get a lot of shares and likes on those. People who are impacted, people who are making a change, hero stories, that's original reporting. The second kind of story, if we're talking about non-polarized work, is investigative stories. Stories that you don't find on the mainstream. And I'm going to give you an example. There's been very little discussion on Tira and many people who are obviously being displaced yet again because of another military operation. We sent our reporter, he did a story, it got a lot of likes. Para Chinar was a story that was not discussed in the mainstream. So we look at those things where we look at those gaps. What is the mainstream not able to do? We try to do it. That's original reporting, and it works.
Is that because mainstream media has more pressure and the digital media has less pressure? Is that one factor?
It is partially one factor, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure you will testify to this. I know many colleagues who've been told that they are sent, lines for what kind of tickers are going to run, what kind of stories will get done. I have to admit that I was on mainstream media for about 4 years, between 2016 and 2020. And increasingly towards the end, I was told, I can't have this guest on my show, I can't have this guest on my show. This was dictated by the state. And I did not return for that reason, because I believe that you need to have diverse opinion, you need to have original reporting. And I think with Nukta, we've been able to prove that it is successful. You can look away from polarized popular narratives. Yes, absolutely. They'll probably get more views and likes. But people are still seeking, despite the fact that there is confirmation bias, people are still seeking fresh perspective, fresh stories, human interest stories, and original investigative stories, which is something that the mainstream is also not doing.
You know, you use this term, which is very interesting, Zeinab. She said polarized and popular. And I think that's the issue. If you polarize, you become popular. And if you become popular, you get a larger audiences, and your career skyrockets. Whether you're an organization, whether you're an individual, you are being forced by the audiences to produce a kind of content which appeals to their biases. And therefore you're automatically diluting the truth, or whatever stands for truth nowadays. So that's a pressure, and there's no way you can reverse that, can you?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think your collective approach and kind of, universal approach, an audience, the media, the world, it's much more fragmented than that. Some members of the audience, the public opinion, may seek the kind of coverage which reinforces their own prejudices. But there are other members of audiences who actually are trying to find, some kind of light on a topic which may be difficult. So I wouldn't say it's so binary, just as when you say the legacy, mainstream media and digital media, the mainstream media is increasingly seeking different platforms. So for example, BBC World Service Radio is listened to more digitally than it is on the radio. And that is the direction of travel. The old business model for the mainstream media is acknowledged as being bust. The independent channels that sought advertising as revenue, advertisers now can go to Google, can go to YouTube, can go to so many places. So that business model is broken. The public service broadcasters, and by the way, there is a difference between, for the BBC, being a state broadcaster or a national broadcaster. Britain, for better or worse, is a democracy. The BBC has very strong editorial guidelines that, safeguard its independence. It's not the case of, the presidential office ringing up saying, we don't like this coverage, take this person off. It's a national broadcaster, which means it's available nationwide, which is very different from, state TV in Zimbabwe or whatever. although in the United States, of course, we do see independent journalists and journalism, coming under attack because, you can get into the White House press conference only if you say the right thing. So even democracies can be assailed. But I think it's become much more grey than this kind of, digital versus mainstream media. It's becoming more blurred, and the mainstream media puts out many things on YouTube and so on. So I think that the dust is settling. It's not quite clear how it's going, but we know that the old model of watching TV where you go on and watch the news at 6 p.m., that's finished, yeah.
But what may have also finished, Azad Essa, is this universal standard of what journalism is and what good journalism is. I mean, a few decades back, you could say, okay, well, if you can do journalism like BBC or you can do journalism like XYZ, then you're doing good journalism. And these are the universal standards that we must all aspire to. That doesn't hold anymore. Like, for example, people who like Al Jazeera would say, that's the journalism that we want. People who follow BBC would. So, you find your own brand of truth that suits you, and you follow the kind of journalism that appeals to your truth. And therefore, the Republic TV in India, which is trash, thinks that they do the best kind of journalism, and they have a huge following. So the fragmentation of what actual good journalism is, that's also completely diminished the value of mainstream journalism. Do you agree? And I'm being deliberately harsh on my profession.
These conversations sometimes are really difficult because we assume that, journalism was one particular thing before this moment. It was always a contested thing. But the level of dissemination of information that we have today creates this sort of crisis that we are in which we don't know what journalism is, or we think we don't know. But I think we have to consider the different forms of journalism that exists. So, for example, if you have a non-profit, investigative units in the US or in South Africa or in the UK or in any other part of the world, they do their work, they put the information out, they're not necessarily looking for the big hits. They are doing a public service. And it's almost as if, like, in a way, journalism is a public good as much as possible. That's the way to go in terms of trying to get that form of journalism out. But in the same way, in the past, you had newspapers, obviously being distributed, but not everyone read the newspaper. They'll go to the town square and listen to what people are saying, right? And then decide on what the news is, or the interpretation of the newspaper from a third or second source. So the social media also plays that role in which people are also passing on information that was originally in person. So my point being is that there's always going to be streams of journalism, and people are going to consume what they want to consume. They'll consume the hard, investigative, maybe not so interestingly, beautifully written piece, right? But they're interested in that topic. There'll be others who want to read the New Yorker and move into a sort of stylized narrative long piece. The others who just want to consume short video clips. And that's how the world has always been, but it's just come from different places. And so I don't think it's a crisis in that form. It's just that the way we see it, makes it confusing sometimes as journalists, because we do see the patterns in which your information or your stories are put out there, and then an influencer takes it and then builds their own narrative to it, and then they become famous over it. And you're not recognized necessarily for the work that you've done. So that's sort of like in many ways, that crisis that sort of builds, in which you wonder, like, how do I make the most impact, or do I need to wait for someone else to share it because of their fame, so that story goes far? So we are also very reliant on that, because we see some stories go further than other stories, and based on just purely because one politician or one celebrity basically sharing it. And I think that's where the confusion comes in.
Let me just have a final question with Amber, then let's open up the floor for questions. Amber, so let's come to Pakistan quickly. And I'll ask you a really easy question. Do you think it's possible to do journalism in Pakistan if you're not serving A, B, or C?
Probably very difficult. I do think that it's very difficult. And I want to sort of expand on what Azad said as well. What is the functions of it? What does a journalist do? At the bottom of the pyramid, if we look at it as a pyramid, news gathering, then it's verification, then it's processing, then it's distribution, and then it's opinion shaping. At the moment, we think of journalism just as the opinion shaping. Those are the content creators who actually use the work that the news gathering and the verification work is that's being done by reporters, which is extremely important, which people still rely on, which content creators or analysts and commentators rely on. So I think that from what I've seen, when I read newspapers, when I look at television, it honestly just runs a lot of press conferences. I don't see any, there's most of it is filled not with original work or news gathering. It's a lot of press conferences. However, I do want to add that also people tune in when there are big events. So, for example, I'd say again, I'll just go back to the Pakistan-India conflict. You had a real bump in viewership because people were interested. It's event related. You also had a bump in viewership with Gul Plaza. It's very event based because what mainstream media has as an advantage over smaller digital platforms like Nukta is that they have a larger network of reporters who can do the verification and news gathering. But at the same time, I think with audiences becoming fragmented and really looking to content creators and opinion shapers to not inform their view, but actually say what they want to say, or because they like them, because they've developed a parasocial relationship with them. Which is what I think with the mainstream media or in Pakistan, I think that would be anchors such as yourself, right? Or vloggers who are incredibly popular. And we forget that there is actually an appetite and an audience for that verification and that news gathering. It's still there. It's still very
Could
much
I
there.
just add a point? Your pyramid is a very good analogy, but I would also say that the role of a good journalist is the investigative function, which the revelatory. There are many scandals and injustices and humanitarian disasters in the world that are worthy of revelation. And I think that still the role of a good journalist is to shine a light on these injustices. It's not just, the verification of the news cycle and so on, and also accountability, holding leaders to account either through, robust interviews or, getting access to them and challenging them on their views. So accountability of our leaders is also something that the journalists should do. And revelatory, and I say this because, yes, we're talking about the Gaza crisis, but in fact, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world is getting very, very little attention, which is the Sudan and the conflict there. 70,000 dead in Gaza, of course, it's a disaster, but 200,000 dead in the Sudan, and the fighting is continuing, and the women are continuing to be raped, and the girls, and the boys for that matter. Huge food insecurity. Now, where is the journalist in all that? So there is a function for the journalist, very difficult to report there. But, there are people who are trying to build up a bit of a picture. So when we talk about the role of the journalist, this revelatory function and shining a light on forgotten conflicts or prisoners of conscience or whatever is a very, very important part of, what we do.
Although holding leadership to account comes with a fair amount of risk also. So we need to factor that in. All right, let's open the floor to questions. Please do identify, who you're directing the question to. So let's start from that side. G. G. Mic दीजिएगा जी इधर. वो है पीछे उनको मैंने आइडेंटिफाई किया. जी आप बोलिए जब तक माइक आ रहा है. आप बोलिए. सॉरी एक सेकंड, वो पीछे मैंने उनको रिकॉग्नाइज किया, उसके बाद मैं आपके पास आता हूँ. जी जी प्लीज. Who are you asking the question to? Anybody? नहीं आप किससे पूछ रहे हैं सवाल? कोई भी कर to you.
Oh, it's to me. I think that's a very, very good point. That you know, when you go through the media and so on, it's all very negative. I mean, that's the nature of news: is that it favours the negative. You know, a person crossing a road safely is not news. A person crossing a road getting killed by a car is news. So the inherent nature of news is that it focuses on the difficult, the negative, and so on, for the reasons I set out. But I think if that people are fed a relentless diet of conflict and problems and so on, it is quite depressing. I mean, you know, you look at the news and you know you want to go away and just sit in a dark room and you know just worry about the whole world. So I think you're absolutely right. There is a place for saying these are, you know, solutions, particularly when you're covering stories in an economic way. If there are, you know, economic crises somewhere, you can show how people are trying to do something about it, or a humanitarian crisis, you know, the emergency response rooms in Sudan that I mentioned and what they're trying to do to help people in need. So I think you're right, we shouldn't just present a diet of despair. So I agree with you.
I'd like to weigh in on that if I could. So, human nature, let's look at human nature. People like stories. And in a story, there's always a hero and a villain. And there's a conflict between that hero and villain. And actually, I would argue that audiences prefer conflict. They don't want solutions. I'll give you an example. At Nukta, we also do a lot of analysis, explainers. Explainers are less emotional. It's less about the hero and the villain and what the solution could be. It does not get as much views and likes as much as viral clips and conflict. So I'd say that it goes back to human nature and the preference for a story in which there is a conflict. And hopefully, we kind of hope that they will stay to the end for the solution, but that's not necessarily the case. So I do think it's very much on audiences.
Jiman. आप बोले आवाज आ रही
the journalist, the individual journalist responsibility is. I understand reportage can be good, it can be bad. As Madam, you said that, you know, it's their job to shine a light on obscure things that are happening and to hold your policymakers and your leaders accountable at a huge cost, like you say, likely huge cost. But when you sit down to write or when you sit down to report on something, you are alone with your writing pen and your own conscience. So at that moment, does a journalist feel some responsibility? I'm
That's a
just
good-
asking this question.
That's a good question. Who wants to take that? Azad, you want to take that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And of course, I think I can only speak personally that when I write a piece or do something like an investigation, of course, I'm always nervous that I have made a mistake after writing the piece. And it's not just about nervous about making a mistake in terms of facts, but it's also about making sure that I have, you know, that emerges, especially on some of the pieces that I may do. But I'm worried about, you know, whether I've made a historical error, or I've misrepresented the person, or I have, you know, acted in a poor way in terms of how I've interviewed them. Because when you're interviewing people, especially on matters of trauma, you know, you are making them relive things. And so it's all about so I do think about my process a lot. I can't speak for all journalists,
Yeah.
but I can speak for myself.
Very quickly, if individual journalists may not, I don't, you know, feel that responsibility like Azad does about being accurate, but I think just as at an organizational level, a reporter is never alone. that reporter will go out. If it's a video, will go out with a cameraman as well. There are desk sub-editors who will look at it, fact-check it, and there's an editor who will vet it. So there's a chain of responsibility. There's a responsibility, a duty of care to the people that you're talking about factual accuracy, the credibility of the organization. So when you rely on individual content creators, they may feel less responsible, but if you rely on news organizations, there is actually a chain of accountability and responsibility built into the system.
I
Checks
agree
and
with that
balances.
totally. I mean, I would say that there is a responsibility for the journalist individually, and you know, anything I do, I'm always thinking, how will I frame this? You're right, there are checks, you know, although increasingly even mainstream journalists sometimes may just go out as a video journalist on their own. So I think there's a difference between the responsibilities you feel when you're on your own in the field, when you may actually just be the only person, and what you choose to cover. And so I would always just think about how I'm going to frame this. And as you said, both of you, you know, comment is free, but fact is sacred. And you really do try to do your best to ensure that you, you know, stick to the facts and get that balance and accuracy that I talked about. So certainly there's a lot of responsibility.
Hi, first of all, good evening. And I'm a fellow journalist. I've been on the field, off the field, editorial, reporting, on camera, off camera. So I worked with mainstream media, traditional media, print, broadcast, etc. Okay? Let's put it this way. The question is, to what extent, or what's the role of a journalist in fighting for his story when institutional media, even if it's not mainstream media, have set agendas based on which they put certain editors to edit the stories. So when you give them a factual story and they edit the words to give it to the audience, to what extent a journalist has the ability to fight for that story to appear as factual as possible? And to what extent can traditional media gain back the trust of the people when they keep dishing them what they think people should read, not what reality is? And I'll give you an example. When it comes to wording, BBC uses young ladies for baby girls being assassinated by the Israelis in Gaza and in Lebanon. Young girls or young ladies, because they want to insinuate that these people are old enough and it's okay to kill them. When it comes to reporting on media being killed by the Israeli occupation, one of my best friends, Zeinab Badawi, a video journalist for Reuters, was murdered by the Israeli occupation in broad daylight when he was sitting with a gathering of international media in an open field, and the Israelis dealt them 2 bombs from a tank right across from the borders. And Reuters actually wrote a report saying, our video journalist Hassan Abdallah was killed, full stop. They didn't say the culprit. We are looking into the matter. We had literally identified that the Israelis did it because we called UNIFIL and we called the Lebanese army. BBC could have done it, Reuters could have done it in literally 1 hour with calling the contacts, but they didn't. And the editor chose to eliminate any responsibility on the Israelis or naming the Israelis in that report that was published, okay? And the third one, also BBC. During the beginning of the war in Syria, I was working with the Wall Street Journal at that time, and they published a picture saying that this was the massacre committed by Assad regime using gas against its own people. And that picture was from Reuters from Iraq during an explosion in a market. And we sent letters to BBC as reporters and as professionals that they have to take it down, and they refused to take it down. They refused to also publish a correction. So it's a matter of basically how you mislead the audience using words or mutilating a reporter's article by using the wrong image and insinuating this is the truth. So how can you gain back the trust of the people so you can gain people's viewership and basically compete?
Thank you for raising this very important point, because this is exactly what we've been talking about throughout this session, and I think because BBC has been mentioned, so
Yeah,
you might
sure,
want to.
of course. You bring up a very, very good point about trust. And I think trust is a very, very, something that's very easy to lose and very difficult to regain. So as I said at the beginning, the BBC doesn't get it right all the time. And there are many examples, the Doctors in Gaza documentary, which it commissioned last year and then decided not to broadcast and then it was broadcast by another public service broadcaster, Channel 4 in the UK. And Channel 4 is subjected to the same kind of regulatory control that the BBC is. And the BBC got a lot of criticism. Why can Channel 4 put out this documentary about doctors working in Gaza, but not the BBC? So for sure, it gets some things wrong. But on the whole, as I said, there are many honorable people who are trying to do the right thing. And I think to use a dozen examples out of the massive output, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, more correspondence in the world than any other news organization. If you take the totality of what it does, you will find 12, 15, examples of like the ones you've given, but the overwhelming majority will be people who are really trying to do their best in very difficult circumstances where there are restrictions on reporting. And I think that that is my experience of the colleagues I've worked over many years. Is there a hidden agenda in your question, in the sense that there is an inbuilt bias that it is the British government that is somehow saying to BBC reporters or the BBC leadership that you have to present the Gaza-Israeli conflict in a certain way? I don't think so. And certainly the United Kingdom has recognized Palestine as a state, as its foreign policy, despite a lot of criticism. I mean, one of the European countries, it has said that it will do that. But so when you get criticisms from both sides, the Israelis and the Palestinians, I think you're doing something right. So is there an inbuilt bias that, editors are thinking, oh, I can't say this because it's pro-Palestinian and I must give a pro-Israeli point of view? I don't think that that is there. Does it get it wrong sometimes? Undoubtedly, but who doesn't?
Let's just we have time for like maybe one question. ये mic किधर है जी? ये इधर दीजिए. You want उनको दीजिएगा? Then we have one more question. जी welcome. जी.
I mean, not to pile on into the BBC, but I mean, I think the issue is that people are able to see through via all of the different channels that are out there, meaning that I don't mean TV channels, but through their social media, through the reportage, through places like Al Jazeera, through like Middle East Eye, for instance, where I work. And then they also understand that it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to tell someone how to report on something. People understand the self-censorship that takes place in these organizations. People understand that people are placed in positions of power, so then stories are not told in a particular way. So even if there are cases of like 12 examples or 15, people notice patterns, and it's hard to undermine that perspective. And it's also, I think the crisis that we have reached now is that people also look at, I think what is different from the past is that when we look at the New York Times, look at the BBC, look at the Washington Post, you kind of understand that on this story, we can trust. On this story, we cannot trust. On this story, there's an immense bias. We don't know where that bias is coming from. We can't prove it. But if it sort of kind of mirrors the state, or mirrors the way the state has sort of spoken about this issue, or the way that if the state is sending weapons to that place, what kind of sort of conclusion can you reach, essentially? And I think that people are kind of fed up in that way with regards to being told that no, actually, this is sort of like, this is just a mistake. And I think that's the crisis in terms of the mainstream media.
Okay, Ji ma'am, you wanted to.
My question was going to be something else, but I feel a little sad that the lady, the examples that she gave have been trivialized, that they're just a few and hundreds and thousands are actually factual, and she's just got a few of them. That sort of trivializes the entire tragedy. I wanted to ask Fahd Hussain, at the beginning you said that pallbearers and is the media dying. So was that a Freudian slip, or did you actually mean pallbearers, that the media is dying? Was that a Freudian slip? And the other thing is this question is actually pointless. Does it serve the truth? You're all saying that you're accountable and responsible to the media houses that you work for, and that the truth then has to be neutralized a bit, made more palatable. So the media does not serve the truth. We have seen it. BBC has been our absolute, guru, God when we were growing up, and then we discovered it had horrible feet of clay. So that's going on with all the media houses, whether it's our local Pakistani ones, and we don't trust anyone. So nobody's serving the truth. You're not intentionally polarizing, but you're not telling the truth. And this reminds us of the example when the Pakistan film media went down and horrible films were being made, and they said, but that's what the audience wants. So we have to make films like that with 50 songs in them. So is the media doing the same thing? We have to do what the audience wants. What does the audience want? Just the truth. And no one is telling the truth. Everybody's truth is sort of affected by something. So this question is pointless. So let me come back to you. Did you really mean pallbearers for coffins, or did you mean as someone supporting the media?
Thank you very much, and thank you for listening to it very closely. No, I did not. I think it was a Freudian slip, but I think it was very timely that way, because I was referring to the fact that what are the chances that mainstream media could actually survive in this day and age. But then, of course, your other comment, I think it's very well said. Amar, do you want to quickly have a quick response to that? The fact that it's not even a question. We are not telling the truth. It's a statement.
Absolutely, and it's, the customer is always right.
See, you trivialize us. That is what happens.
No, this was actually not. I think it's actually comes from a place of respect. I think constantly throughout what I've spoken about is audience. So what the audience wants, what the audience would like to hear. The media is fragmented. There are multiple, and I think Zeinab made that point as well, that we can't see as a monolith. Are you talking about newspapers? Are you talking about television? Are you talking about digital platforms? Are you talking about individual content creators? Are you talking about smaller digital news organizations such as, the one that I work for? So the media is fragmented, and at the moment I would say that there is journalism that is definitely censored, that may not be serving all the truth, may not be presenting everything to you, but there's also other journalism that is. So you have to find what you think is palatable, and you have to find various sources of information. I think at this point in time, with social media, media literacy and digital literacy is incredibly important for audiences as well. You're already very smart. You see through the biases, how headlines are framed. But at the same time, you also have to be conscious of your own bias. The good journalists are conscious of their bias. Bad ones may not be. In fact, they may serve and polarize.
Thank you. Last quick question, Ji. Brief question.
Yes, we see the word post-truth being thrown around. We live in a world of scientific truth, religious truths, truths of all kinds. So is it the nature of truth that the media has failed to evolve to? Or how does this era of radical relativism, in which what we see, what we hear in artificial intelligence is not exactly the truth anymore? So how do we conceive of this changing nature?
So basically the nature of truth. Yeah, Mike, nature of truth, is it difficult to judge now? We'll take the final question, Ji. Ji. Nature of truth, is it difficult to now even judge?
Yes, the lady who was talking about truth, there are competing truths, there are alternative truths now in the world, and nobody has the right to say necessarily that your truth is, better than mine or whatever. That's why I think we have to really try to anchor what we say in facts and try to establish the facts as best we can, because comment is free, opinion is free, but fact is sacred. And I think that's still the role of the good journalist, to try to establish the facts, because the truth at the end of the day is something that is factual.
I'm sorry, I know there are a lot of questions. My apologies, because we are almost out of time. Ji, we'll take the last question.
So I find this ironic. I find this ironic because I think what you're talking about, I was thinking about politics and you were talking about journalism. And after a short while, people have begun to kind of tell us to buzz off as well. because they don't trust us anymore. And I've begun to feel from this conversation that there was a time when I was growing up and we used to have Ted Koppel and 60 Minutes, where people in tweed suits would show up and they would tell you what the world is about, and everyone would say, oh yeah, of course, it's 60 Minutes. And Ted Koppel has said this, so this is what the world is about. And now, because of all the questions that have been raised, the world is telling you to buzz off. And maybe this democratization that you're calling digital, or people are saying, screw, if you're going to tell us the non-truth, I have my own non-truth, so go deal with it. And here, in your face, is this image. Negotiate it with me. And I'm not going to listen to you. And you are not the arbiter. So maybe it's Wikipedia of journalism, where people are going to come in and say, negotiate with me. Your truth, my truth, let's see who's more in numbers. And they're more in numbers. Maybe that's what's happening. Is that the case?
That's a good, solid question to wrap up the debate with. So, do you want to take it, or quickly just one short comment from each?
Yeah, very shortly. I think absolutely, which is why I think people. You're absolutely right, sir. Journalism, obviously, as I said, is not a monolith, but also people do seek different kinds of truth. I'm going to give you two examples. So one is 26 November 2024. How many people or how many protesters died? It's contested. There were many fantastic journalistic organizations that were independent that did those investigations, and yet those numbers remained inflated because people weren't willing to believe them. I'd say another example is Minnesota and video evidence of how Renee Good and how she was killed. If you are follow a particular ideology or political party, you may not believe the evidence of your own eyes. So yes, we are living in a post-truth world, and maybe the solution would be something that is more curated, like Wikipedia.
Okay. We are actually completely out of time. I would have wanted the other two panelists to jump in. Do you have like
a very quick
sentence?
one? Yeah, just a very quick one. I think the retreat from factual-based comment, truth, is very, very important. You know, when we have claims like, take paracetamol when you're pregnant and your child will be autistic or whatever, let's just, amongst all the disinformation and the misinformation, give a shout out for, facts, because I think it's making the world much more dangerous when you have lots of, it's not just about politics and so on, it's about life, like the autism one and so on. And I think that when we're seeing that retreat from facts and so on, it's a dangerous place to be in the world. It's not, it's not good. And the scientists are throwing their hands up in despair as well. It's all part of the same picture.
So that's all the time we have. I'm very grateful to all of you for coming and participating and thinking about topics and issues which are very important but also very alarming for many of us. Thank you very much.